Roman civilization has long been considered the most advanced culture of its time. They did, however, have their nuances. Their biggest quirk was the way the Romans could sit back, chow on a few olives, and watch a tiger maul a Grecian.
The gladiatorial games were inspired from the tradition in which slaves fought each other in honor of their master's passing. They were also believed to appease the gods and keep Rome from disaster. As time passed, the tradition turned into a blood sport which attracted Roman citizens to watch a fight to the death that stripped its combatants of all their rights.
Pop culture has undoubtedly glorified the true meaning of gladiators. We see them today as the equivalent to a celebrity or a famous athlete. The truth, however, is very far from that. Gladiators were treated cruelly, and they were on the very bottom rungs of the Roman social ladder.
Gladiators were professional combatants, criminal slaves, or prisoners of war who entertained the Roman public by engaging in mortal combat with other gladiators or wild animals. In fact, Roman courts had the authority to sentence criminals to death to fight as gladiators. They were forced to train in a ludus, a gladiatorial school. At this school, gladiators were taught how to draw out a battle to provide a show for the spectators.
Not only is the belief that gladiators were admired false, but a large misconception is that the thumbs up meant that the gladiator got to live. The opposite, in fact, is true. When a gladiator had his opponent at knife point, the other gladiator had the right to ask the spectators for mercy. If the majority of the crowd had their thumbs pointing down, it meant that the gladiator was spared and would live another day. If the majority, however, had their thumbs up, it meant a swift death for the gladiator. Gladiators had to put their lives in the hands of the crowd and hope for the best. They had no control over their lives, and everything they were forced to do was to please the spectators of Rome. Roman gladiators had the right to murder and die at the pleasure of the crowd, and the responsibility placed on them by their masters to give the spectators a good show, no matter what the cost.
Gladiators were divided into different types. Archaeologists have found evidence of 30 different types of gladiators. The type of gladiator they became depended on their social status and athletic ability. There were Thracians who wore hardened leather on both legs and used a small square shield. He would wear either a full or open-faced helmet with a wide brim, and he used a curved blade called a scimitar.
Thracians, who were usually the smaller, quicker gladiators, were usually pitted against a hoplomachus, who were usually slower but stronger. They used a spear, a small shield with a full helmet, and protective armor.
There are Murmillo gladiators who had heavy armor that weighed 30 to 40 pounds. They usually fought against Thracians, who were the underdogs. Retiarius, who carried a throwing net, trident, and dagger, were pitted against the secutor, who fought with a sword and a large shield with elaborate armor.
These gladiators were forced to live and train together at a ludus, a gladiatorial training camp or prison. The people they had come to live with and care about became their opponents, the ones that they had to kill the next day.
Suicide was not uncommon in the gladiatorial games. When they were initiated and branded as gladiators, they were forced to accept the highest disgrace. Their lives were literally no longer their own. Once they took the gladiator's oath, it forced them to accept that they would live and die at the whim of their masters. Gladiators became worse than slaves. They became objects.
All gladiators were forced to agree to the Sacramentum Gladiatorium, or the gladiator's oath. It stated that they agreed to beating, burning, and death by the sword if they did not perform as required. Not only did gladiators face incredible shame, but the misconception that gladiators were admired and comparable to today's celebrities or athletes is wildly inaccurate. They were loathed by all. At the lowest social status, they were looked down on with contempt by slaves and beggars. Gladiators were a source of scorn and entertainment. The closest thing we have today resembling the gladiatorial games are bullfights.
It shows the paucity of rights that gladiators had, when the closest comparison we have is one to which we compare human beings sentenced to a violent death to cattle.
Not only were the gladiators stripped of their rights, but the games were also the back of Roman politics. Political careers could be started from hosting the games. The public's favor could be won by hosting a successful gladiatorial match. Large sums of money could also be won or lost by betting on the fighters. At the end of the day, the gladiators who had been killed were stripped of not only their weapons and armor, but also of any rights that they may have had in death. The gladiator's oath came into play then. The dead gladiator was ripped of their dignity, and their weapons were returned to their masters.
The few rights gladiators did have were basically useless. They were allowed to marry, but rarely did they find spouses. Not only did they have very little to offer, but their partners didn't know if they would be dead or alive the next day.
Gladiators had only one responsibility, to give the spectators a good show. Their new jobs became to murder or die at the whim of the bloodthirsty crowds of ancient Rome. Gladiators have shown the atrocities that humans are capable of. People gladly watch two desperate human beings fight for their lives, all to see who would survive the next day. Throughout history, the rights of war prisoners have improved drastically, from stripping humans of their rights and forced them to fight for their lives, all at the pleasure of an audience, to giving people actual trials. Times have changed, and we owe it to the gladiators, opening our eyes so we could see the lack of human rights.
Roman gladiators had the right to murder and die at the pleasure of the crowd, and the responsibility placed on them by their masters to give the crowd a good show, no matter what the cost.